Today we conclude our Hoenn Starter Trio remake series with none other than the blazing kickin' chicken itself, Blaziken. Blaziken has been a massive fan favorite ever since players first chose Torchic to save Professor Birch from a Poochyena in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, while May had a Torchic she raised all the way into a Blaziken in the anime. Fans were also stunned when Harrison's Blaziken defeated Ash's Charizard. The firefighting combination was so beloved, Game Freak wound up making the fire starters for the next 2 generations have fighters as well, but Blaziken, the original, was the only one to get a Mega Evolution. Today we're going to dive into Blaziken's history in the competitive scene. And so we ask, was Torchic's final evolution everything, or was it just Ken? In other words, how great was Blaziken actually? And in this video we'll be going over these competitive formats. Blaziken's frailty and plethora of weaknesses meant its defensive profile was practically non-existent. Its speed stat was decent, but only just. With such shortcomings, Blaziken wasn't going to be a true blue OU Pokemon in its debut generation of Advanced. Meanwhile, there was no chance of it dropping to UU, as it would bludgeon that metagame beyond recognition. Thus, it would stay in BL. It was, however, a legitimate choice in the OU metagame thanks to its ferocious firefighting stab combination, which tore through the defining defensive duo of Skarmory and Blissey. Blaziken's calling was as a wall breaker, and it was built beautifully for this role, as it didn't just tear through Bliss. Sure, Swampert resisted Fire Blast and didn't fear Sky Uppercut very much, but it was obliterated by Blaziken's strong HP Grass. Tier King Tyranitar didn't want to come anywhere near Sky Uppercut either. The Gengar commonly partnered with them was crushed by Fire Blast and wasn't going to hurt Blaziken in return without exploding. And on top of that, you'd take a Blaziken for Gengar trade any day, if the Gengar even had Boom. Plus, the immunity to Will-O-Wisp was valuable as an entry point for it to start wreaking havoc. As a bonus, if Blaziken dipped to low health, its Blaze ability would activate and Gengar would get absolutely hammered by Fire Blast, making the Gar user really have to think twice about shipping it down with Thunderbolt. So that's 5 out of the 6 Pokemon seen on the most standard team style in Advance, which were utterly terrified of Blaziken. The 6th Pokemon on this team was always shifting, but switching into Blaziken wasn't a pleasant task. Even the likes of Zapdos or Aerodactyl wouldn't exactly enjoy it. As such, Blaziken was quite a solid wall breaker, as it was extremely vulnerable to Dugtrio. It had difficulty switching into pretty much anything. It struggled against bulkier waters like Milotic and Suicune, and it contributed nothing to its team's defensive integrity, making it rather specific to build with. However, Blaziken was worth it on the right team, where its Bliss busting strengths were taken full advantage of. Despite its unspectacular speed, it was just fast enough to where it efficiently threatened many offensive teams too. If your offensive team had a mix of Tyranitar, Metagross, Snorlax, Swampert, Magneton, Heracross, and Celebi, as many did, you were going to really struggle against Blaziken. Sure, you might have a Salamence in the last slot, but it wasn't going to enjoy taking those Fire Blasts and impeding its ability to sweep off the strength of Dragon Dancing in the face of a hard hit from full health, for example. Finally, Blaziken was even a decent lead. It was able to match up well against 4 of the best, most common leads in Advance in Tyranitar, Metagross, Skarmory, and Zapdos. Wait, Zapdos? Yep, that's right. Blaziken could take an offensive Zapdos Thunderbolt and unleash a ferocious Blaze-boosted Overheat in return. It wasn't ironclad, but it was a legitimate way to start the game against one of the scariest leads. So overall, Blaziken was a specific but solid Pokemon in its debut generation of OU. Power creep ensured Blaziken wasn't going to be breaking into Generation 4's much stronger and, more importantly, faster OU metagame. The introduction of the far faster firefighting phenomenon Infernape, fully outclassing Ken, felt almost like mockery in this regard, but this also came with the byproduct of Blaziken no longer being too broken for UU. As such, it joined the metagame and proceeded to wreak havoc with the many new toys afforded it. First of all, it had much improved fighting stab and superpower, far out damaging the Sky Uppercut it had utilized previously. Second, it had several new methods of boosting its power or bypassing its speed issue. With Life Orb, it hit incredibly hard on both the physical and special side of the spectrum, while with Choice Scarf, it got the jump on offensive Pokemon it otherwise lose to one-on-one, becoming an amazing late game cleaner as a result. Plus, even on non-Scarf sets, it could potentially go first with the new stat priority it had received, Vacuum Wave. Blaziken's mixed sets quickly became among UU's finest, most defining wall breakers, so easy easily and immediately threatening such a large portion of the tier, Registeel, grasses like Venusaur, ghosts like Spiritomb, grounds like Rhyperior and Donphan, it was just nightmarish to handle Blaziken defensively when it was shredding such staples. Getting it on the field was much easier now too, with the addition of U-Turn and the plethora of great Pokemon with the move. Have fun pivoting your Registeel into Scyther and giving Blaziken a free switch. Scarf sets were also particularly apt threats against offense, who usually relied on beating a Pokemon as strong as Blaziken through outspeeding it. Those two variants were Blaziken's go-tos, but that was far from all it could do either. Swords Dance sets were particularly terrifying, whereas Milotic was generally a solid answer to most of Blaziken's attacks. Suddenly, it was in severe danger of a fully physically invested Blaziken with doubled attack. Choice Band sets could also do this, and without the need of a setup turret. The more immediately scary Blaziken was, the better. Even Milotic, by the way, wasn't exactly safe against good old Mixken either. All it took was some spike support, and the big fish was suddenly refusing to switch in for fear of an HP Grass 2-hit KO. Choice Specs Blaziken variants were effective as well, and they even came with the benefit of maximally boosted Vacuum Wave. Whichever variant Blaziken wound up running though, it was a staple on offensive teams throughout the generation. The progress it generated, whether it was the mix set shattering an opponent's defensive core or the Scarfer plowing through fragile offense, was incredibly important to their success. Blaziken was a superb piece of the 4th generation of underused. Hey, remember how Gen 4 Infernape totally outclassed Blaziken by virtue of its much higher speed? Well, the 5th generation's Dream World blessed Blaziken with the speed boost ability, and just like that, the tables were completely turned. After a single turn, Blaziken was far faster than Infernape, and it would only get faster with each passing turn, meaning even Choice Scarfers would eventually be unable to stop it. Its potential seemed absolutely stunning, and the player base immediately put it to the test. A test it high jump kicked its way through with flying colors. Oh yeah, it wasn't just faster, it was now stronger too, with high jump kick having been buffed to an absolutely stunning 130 base power, leaving close combat and superpower in the dust. And of course, its fire stab was boosted by the new addition of Permanent Sun. Not that Blaziken needed Sun, it was plenty excellent on sand teams and weatherless offense, particularly that with the screaming fast tempo set by Deoxys Speed, which Blaziken could now match and deliver not just the speed, but the brutal power such teams needed to take advantage of early hazards, or in the case of boosting with Swords Dance, dual screens. Now, Blaziken was already scary just with the toolkit of its stabs, offenses, and speed boosts, but when it had such diversity in its moveset, it became downright ridiculous to check it safely. Want to deny it the free turn it needs to get the speed boost? Oops, it has Protect, which will also let it outrun your Scarfer or Sandrush Excadrill with ease. Think your Gliscor or Garchomp beats it one-on-one? Yeah, until you get HP iced. Tentacruel in Rain is a good answer, right? Until you get Earthquaked into Oblivion, yeah. Yet Blaziken even threatened Rain teams beautifully. You couldn't even switch Politoed in against it safely to try and change the weather since it got so badly shellacked by High Jump Kick. Jellicent and Latias take Blaziken on, right? Yeah, about that. Swords Dance boosted Shadow Cloud would run them over. Or just Swords Dance boosted Flare Blitz in the sun. Because as if the ability to mix and match so many different options into its moveset wasn't dangerous enough, Blaziken could also just straight up overpower you. Oh, and this is just in terms of moves. Forget the many item options it could run. Life Orb's absurd power was the standard, of course, but Lumberry would shrug off Thundurus's Prankster Thunder Wave. Air Balloon would give it protection from earthquakes as well as setup opportunity in the face of would-be checks, and some players even ran leftovers to more freely spam Flare Blitz without fear of recoil. It worked especially well in conjunction with Protect. Blaziken was immediately a source of great consternation amongst the player base, as even by Gen 5's high standards, its power was shocking for a Pokemon that was so quickly and easily capable of outspeeding everything in sight. Thus, it wasn't too long into Black and White before it was up on the chopping block, ahead of monsters like Sandville Garchomp, Sandrush Excadrill, Thundurus Incarnate, and Deoxys Speed. Imagine facing a sand team with Blaziken, Veilchomp, and Rush Exca. Yeah, that sounds delightful, and yet it was reality. And despite the complaints of the more casual player base that Blaziken couldn't be broken, it was a starter Pokemon after all. It received the Banhammer with resounding certainty, marking history as the first starter Pokemon to ever be banned from OU. That wasn't all for Blaziken in Gen 5 either. If it did well on OU Sun with Ninetales as a setter, imagine Ubers with Groudon. Blaziken was more than strong enough to clash with the best of the best, and was a fearsome sweeper on Sun offense teams. There was little more delightful than watching Arceus Ghost get completely obliterated by boosted Flare Blitz in the sun. Have fun switching Kyogre Kyogre in to change the weather. Just like OU against Politoed, Blaziken would delight in slamming it with Fighting Stab, helping win the weather war. It wasn't the easiest Pokemon to slap on a team, since its frailty was especially notable by Uber standards, but the effort was well worth it since Blaziken's ability to run away with the game was just incredible. And in Black and White 2, when Scarf Genesect took over the tier, that was just fine by Blaziken, considering how badly it dominated it. All in all, Blaziken had an absolutely incredible Generation 5. Sadly, for all the terror Blaziken wreaked in singles, it could not translate these talents to VGC. Its frailty was far too exploitable in the 2-on-2 format, especially when it was so vulnerable to the incredibly common spread moves Surf and Earthquake. Sure, it hit hard, but not nearly as hard as it needed to overcome these flaws, and the necessity and thus predictability of its Protect made it even easier to play around. Blaziken wasn't getting any serious use in Gen 5 VGC. Funnily enough, it was outclassed by Infernape, who had far greater double-centric utility thanks to Fake Out and Encore. No more permanent weather in Generation 6? No problem. Blaziken was hardly sun dependent. If anything, this would help, as it no longer be buffeted by permanent sand or annoyed by permanent rain. Plus, more importantly, it wasn't just that Blaziken was still an utter beast. For most other Pokemon of its caliber, access to the newly buffed Knockoff, an amazing move in its own right that doubled as excellent coverage against checks like Slowbro and the Laddies, would be more than enough to make Blaziken users happy. But no, it went much further than that. The already terrifying Blaziken got itself a Mega Evolution, which also packed speed boost, and it was faster, so it had an even easier time outpacing the opposition with as few boosts as possible. And it was hilariously strong without being hindered by the recoil of Life Orb. And just for kicks, or high jump kicks, am I right? Game Freak even buffed both its defenses, so it would be even more difficult to take out. Yikes. Mega Blaziken dominated the earliest days of XYOU, though everyone was absolutely certain it'd never last, but funnily enough, it wasn't the Mega in isolation that wound up getting it canned. It was the fact that base Blaziken itself was already absurd. Yeah, Talonflame is a so-called check, sure. Even the staunchest of the anti-ban crowd quickly admitted that this wasn't nearly enough to pacify the relentlessness of both Blaziken forms' assault. Sometimes you wouldn't even want to run Mega Blaziken, since base Blaziken was such a terror to begin with, and it allowed you to run another Mega. Imagine, if you will, facing Blaziken and Mega Charizard Y, providing Sun on the same team. Fun! Or you could make it Mega Kangaskhan or Gengar and have some real absurdity. Of course, it wasn't just base Blaziken, as Mega Blaziken was just unreal. It was basically everything nuts about Blaziken ramped up to 11, with even the added bulk helping it out. Forget picking it off nearly as easily with Extreme Speed, for example. If the original Blaziken was the Fast and the Furious, Mega Blaziken was too fast to Blaziken. Blaziken itself was very quickly, just about immediately banned from OU. Its stay in the tier as short as it was brutally destructive in both forms. Despite lacking the permanent Sun support from Groudon this time around, Blaziken appeared in Ubers once again. Its Mega was a fixture on Deoxys Speed hyper offense teams throughout X and Y OU. In addition to its ferocious, fast-paced offensive output, its ability to hit incredibly hard without taking Life Orb recoil, as well as its higher defense, meant it was much more difficult for Arceus to revenge kill with Extreme Speed. Its higher speed also meant the opponent's window for outrunning it after speed boost closed much more quickly. Forget outrunning it with Mega Mewtwo Y, for example, which it could more easily against base Blaziken. Of course, if such a team wanted to run a different Mega, then base Blaziken was still similarly fierce, and good play could get around the speed issue. Both were quite popular and effective during this early period. Sadly, ORAS put an end to this with the introduction of both Mega Salamence and the reintroduction of the Soldew Laddie twins. Suddenly, Blaziken seriously struggled to include everything it needed to in its moveset. Even if it did go with either of HP Ice for Mega Ments or Knockoff for the Laddies, it'd still be missing Stone Edge for Ho-Oh too, and thus slotting it into a team became much more difficult by virtue of not being able to rely on it to be as consistently capable of hitting pretty much the whole metagame hard nearly as much as required from it. With the right moveset though, it could still be an incredible threat, and thus Blaziken retained a genuine niche, albeit on the specific side. Fast-paced offense teams could utilize its power in almost a kamikaze style, blasting apart everything in sight with little regard for itself so a teammate could clean up. Mega Blaziken basically disappeared though, as this kind of role was not something you'd want to relegate your Mega slot to. You'd rather run base Blaziken and clean up with Mega Salamence, for example. So overall, both forms of Blaziken had an outstanding, defining Generation 6. Even in its Mega form, Blaziken still wasn't much of a VGC Pokemon, as its flaws were still highly prominent and competition for the Mega slot was stiff. The problem was that base Blaziken with Life Orb was actually stronger than Mega. Yes, frailer, as it took Life Orb recoil and was slower, but you wanted power from that slot, so why not go for the stronger option? And still, base Blaziken was just as flawed as before, if not more, with the insane popularity of Talonflame, making life even more difficult for it. Still, if you really wanted to use it, which, let's be real, was because you wanted to use Blaziken, not because it was the best choice, it wasn't going to be an outright terrible Pokemon. With HP Ice to scare Landorus, Therian, and Mega Salamence, Overheat and Superpower did decently well against the rest of the tier. Nothing spectacular, but well enough to pose a threat in the occasional good matchup. Its usage was respectable for what it was, with notable placements as follows: Josh Krieger, 10th at the Oregon Regionals, William Collins, 3rd at the Florida Regionals, Juan Nar, 1st at the Columbia Regionals, Aaron Liebersbach, 9th at the US Nationals, and Aaron Zhang, 28th at Worlds. Funnily enough, some Mega Blaziken were seen as well, mostly in Europe, and they were basically the same as base Blaziken, minus the Life Orb recoil, which these players deemed worth their Mega slot, and they made it work too, with Jamie Miller reaching 11th at the German Nationals, and Gilberto Garacci reaching 2nd at the Italian Regionals. So not bad for a Pokemon generally not even thought of to be part of the meta. Come Generation 7, OU had learned its lesson, and there would be no more tolerating Blaziken in OU, Mega or otherwise. There was no need to get thrashed by it for a few days before seeing it in action would be the deciding factor tipping it over the edge. Nah, to go through that again would just be foolishness. It is to their immense credit that nobody was tricked into thinking Blaziken would be easier to handle with the presence of new so-called checks in Tapu Fini and Toxapex. Nope, they just give you the illusion you were fine against it until you actually sent them in, and Blaziken blew them away with a Swords Dance Thunder Punch. No need to entertain that again, and thus Blaziken made history by becoming the first starter Pokemon to begin the generation in Ubers. As for Blaziken's place in the Uber metagame itself, both forms faced the severe challenge that was Zygarde Complete, which was an incredible check. The metagame was far bulkier as well, featuring heavy emphasis on tanking teams with the likes of Lugia, Giratina, Ho-Oh, and sometimes even Slowbro. It wasn't just their bulk which made it difficult for Blaziken to consistently break holes in such teams, but the difference in coverage they demanded, as it couldn't always fit the moves it wanted. And it wasn't just relegated to bulky teams either, as a Stone Edge lacking Blaziken wouldn't just lose out on Ho-Oh, but Mega Salamence as well. However, it was still full of potential and thus saw solid levels of viability and usage on heavily offensive teams. At least Mega Blaziken did anyway. The Mega was far preferred, as its greater resilience in the face of Arceus' extreme speed was invaluable. Additionally, its higher speed meant it needed fewer boosts to outrun Pokemon like Deoxys Attack and Scarf Xerneas or Yveltal. Base Blaziken, on the other hand, was just not going to be at all reliable enough for any sort of viability. Too frail, too exploitable with Life Orb recoil, too slow, and this new metagame had advanced too far for it. However, come Ultra Sun and Moon, competition for team slot, Mega and non-Mega alike, was fiercer than ever, and Mega Blaziken took a major hit. It still had its place, but it was far more limited and specific than before. Blaziken was just as flawed for all the same reasons in Generation 7, but it managed to get some placements nonetheless. Most notably, Gilberto Garacci, who had reached 2nd with it in Italy during the previous generation, managed to improve on his standing. He actually won the Nashville Open with an all-physical Mega Blaziken. Congrats to him. Mega Blaziken's other placements were as follows: Miguel Gonzalez, 23rd at the Valencia special event, David Kotish, 24th at Worlds, Alessio Fusca, 47th at the Europe Internationals, Jeremy Rodriguez, 21st at Hartford Regionals, and Alan Martinez, 18th at the Santa Clara Regionals. Again, not bad for a Pokemon not on most players' radar whatsoever. Generation 8's Crown Tundra rolled around and Blaziken returned, no Mega or Z move in tow. Well, it didn't need either of those to be threatening, but the player base generally felt, a few exceptions notwithstanding, that it might be palatable now. It might seem strange because Blaziken actually got majorly buffed, receiving the amazing U-turn as well as close combat from Fighting Stab. Wait, wasn't CC 10 base power weaker than High Jump Kick? Yes, it was, but close combat also didn't have to tread lightly around hitting into Protect or Ghost types, since it didn't have High Jump Kick's drawback of majorly damaging Blaziken if the move was stifled. This much more reliable choice meant Blaziken didn't have to risk getting the High Jump Kick. However, despite these buffs, Blaziken still had plenty of issues. Its loss of hidden power ice was significant, as no longer could it instantly threaten Landorus Therian and Garchomp. Most importantly though, with the addition of heavy duty boots and the prevalence of Regenerator alongside them, it was much easier for huge checks of teams to stay at high health, making checking Blaziken much easier. Its long-standing enemy Slowbro was particularly popular in this regard, and Toxapex's precocious presence didn't help matters at all, especially with their constant use alongside Landorus Therian, and with the tier's focus on longevity, Blaziken's complete dearth of defensive utility was doubly damning. Even if it did scare the opponent, it was difficult to extract the most of it before it went down. Even OU's most offensive Pokemon had defensive utility in Gen 8, so justifying Blaziken's team slot was quite difficult. It still absolutely had the capacity to tear through the entire metagame if it got going. It would just take some time before players figured out the optimal way to best utilize Blaziken's talents. For the time being, that meant Blaziken's usage was lower, so low as it dropped to UU. Now, if you think Speed Boost Blaziken in UU sounds like the most hilariously overpowered thing imaginable, you'd be absolutely right. It effortlessly bowled over everything in sight. It lacked worthwhile defensive checks to its brutal offensive onslaught, which wouldn't have necessarily been too much on its own, though it's likely to have raised several eyebrows anyway. But with Speed Boost, offensive counterplay disappeared almost immediately. In a similar vein, Blaziken dropped to UU early in the Crown Tundra, but also disappeared from the tier very quickly, receiving an enthusiastic majority of ban votes. It took some time, but the OU player base did eventually realize how to make use of what Blaziken offered. A set with Swords Dance, Protect, Leftovers, and even significant HP investment took off and had a significant impact on the tier, with HP investment lowering the percentage of health loss from Flare Blitz recoil, and Protect helping it gain more health back through Leftovers. Playing around Blaziken through recoil was no longer a viable option. This Blaziken set had several superb traits. It was an offensive killer that couldn't be revenge killed easily, not just because of Speed Boost aided by Protect, ensuring it could outrun even the likes of Zeraora without much trouble, but also because of its amazing resistance to Rillaboom's priority Grassy Glide. But wouldn't that still be dangerous with a close combat drop and or Flare Blitz recoil? Yes, but that's where Protect came in handy. It wouldn't just get Blaziken more Leftovers, but would actually take advantage of Rillaboom's own grassy terrain to get more health back as well. Furthermore, this Blaziken acted as an amazing method of punishing Weavile, which was absolutely invaluable given how devastating the latter was. And Blaziken was an offensive threat, which absolutely pulverized the seemingly immortal Melmetal as well. Blaziken had some set diversity as well. Choice band sets began popping up, punishing opponents trying to play around Blaziken's being less threatening before a boost with immediate power. And while Banded Flare Blitz or Close Combat are already scary moves, they are especially scary when their user is getting faster with each passing turn. Banded U-turn was also a beautiful way of laying the smackdown on the slow twin. Alternatively, Blaziken could also run a vicious 3-attack Swords Dance set with Air Balloon to turn the tables on would-be checks with Earthquake or Life Orb if its own health wasn't a concern and it just wanted to damage as much as possible. The coverage of Thunder Punch or Knockoff also went a long way in letting it brutalize its common answers. No matter what Blaziken ran, it was a legitimate threat and especially effective on Torkoal Sun teams alongside Venusaur to ensure as much Sunny Pain was being brought as possible. It had taken a while, but Blaziken was finally a legitimate OU threat, capping off another superb generation for it. Generation 9's absurd power creep meant even a terrestrializing Blaziken wasn't on the player base's radar, so vicious were its surroundings, mind-boggling though it may seem. Thus, it dropped to UU again, and there it was hilariously broken, and it got itself canned incredibly quickly, because if there's one thing more obscenely busted in the underused metagame than a Speed Boost Blaziken, it's a Speed Boost Blaziken that can either make one of its stabs even scarier, or change its typing entirely to completely ruin your counterplay. UU was so bereft of counterplay against this behemoth, the only recourse to stop Blaziken from blasting everything in sight was pretty much throwing Rocky Helmet Rough Skin Garchomp at it, sacrificing Chomp in the process, and letting Blaziken's contact moves wear it down. Yeah, that's healthy. Imagine a world where Blissy's HP stat converted to Brave Bird recoil damage is the only way to stop Talonflame, and you basically have the UU dynamic of throwing Chomp away, so Blaziken wouldn't completely bowl you over. As such, Blaziken was axed with the quickness, and Garchomp was thrilled that it could gained some sort of use beyond just necessary sacrifice to Blaziken's wrath. So far, Blaziken hasn't really made any impact on OU. With the controversial presence of Gouging Fire, not many players are going to be looking at it at the time of this video. However, even if Gouging Fire isn't banned, the likelihood of Blaziken finding at least some sort of niche seems quite solid. After all, Blaziken is exactly the type of Pokemon that abuses Terrestrialization the best. It's a scary sweeper able to sweep at the drop of a hat, perfectly capable of abusing the game-breaking possibilities of the mechanic. For now though, Blaziken has already had another solid generation, and it will be interesting to see where it winds up. And that's it. So how great was Blaziken actually? Well, in summation, it was Knuff. It was more than Knuff actually. It was great at doing stuff, specifically stuff involving the destruction of opposing defensive cores, which it started doing ever since its OU niche in its debut generation of Advance. It fell to UU in Generation 4, being outclassed by Infernape, but it was a major threat in UU, so all was well. Then Generation 5 came around, granted its speed boost, and Blaziken became the first ever starter Pokemon banned from standard play. It was a no doubt about it Uber for 3 consecutive generations, with the mega it received in Gen 6 being just as terrifying. Blaziken was also useful in Ubers during this time, most especially under Gen 5 Groudon's permanent sun and in its mega form on hyper offense teams in XY pre-ORAS. With Gen 8, several radical changes resulted in Blaziken's drop to UU, though it devastated that tier thoroughly and was banned, and then found itself rocking OU again once the player base figured out how to best use it. It was also canned from Gen 9 UU, being similarly vicious there. It has yet to find an OU niche, but if anything can do it, even in such a power-crept environment, it's speed boost Blaziken. Blaziken is not much of a VGC Pokemon given its immense frailty, but it's also had some decent placements over the years. So overall, Blaziken has had a phenomenal competitive career, unquestionably the best of any starter Pokemon. Thanks for watching everyone, and as always, if you like the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Blaziken? Would you buff it to have it be OU or Ubers again? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazan Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray, Daniel Isbeast, and Glitcherton for their support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.